Hi, Dr. Stein.
Oh, when?
Vicky and I we love these talking with you. I was going to say sessions, but that would make it sound too much like therapy.
Mm. That's
Hello,
a different podcast, yeah.
hello, Vicky, too.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Stein. Hello.
You have had a couple of really good posts lately where you've talked about friendship.
Mhm.
And of course, we'll link to those in the show notes. But in your most recent post, Becoming Close Friends, a practical guide, you tell anecdote about your friend Al. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. Al and I have known each other almost 60 years, which makes me terribly old. Alan's still very young, interestingly enough. But the way I found out about him and got to meet him was back in actually the end of my first semester, first quarter, I guess I would say, in college. And I was friends with a fellow I knew in high school, good friends with him, Harmon. And Harmon got to know Al at Northwestern when they were both first year students. And Alan put Harmon on to the fact that you could be an usher at the Chicago Symphony
Ooh.
and you could get paid for it. And
Ooh.
so, since we all had an interest in classical music, that was very appealing. And Harmon told me about it. Since I wanted to make a buck over the Christmas break, I signed up. And Alan had been there the longest among us. So the relationship went well, sometimes up, sometimes down, but that happens. That's part of things. And I'll talk a little bit about forgiveness and especially about apology later.
Mm.
But in any case, as time went on, I think we just got closer and closer. Well, earlier, either this year or last, I was having some medical problems. And I had been consoling Alan about his own medical issues and actually gave him some advice that turned out to be pretty good. But what happened was, at a certain point, he said to me on the telephone, he said, "I pray for you every day."
Mhm.
Now I was stunned by this. I mean, I had never, I knew people prayed for each other. It was not like that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
He and I weren't terribly religious. And we had talked about everything under the sun. We sure had not talked about prayer.
Mm.
And to my knowledge, he wasn't praying or going to services of any kind, of any religious state. And of course, I thanked him. And it wasn't long either before or after where he also said, again on the phone, that he loved me.
Mm.
Now, Alan was a man who knew women, and to the best of my knowledge, had never approached or been interested in anybody who wasn't a woman nor I,
Mm.
except as friends, of course. Um, and and so I was again shocked, stunned by this, and terribly grateful and terribly moved by it.
Mhm.
And the conclusion of this to me is that first of all, men don't say these things,
Mhm.
especially they don't say "I love you."
Mhm. Mhm.
It is not common, at least in my experience. It was not common to my father's generation. I knew he loved me, but I never heard it, and it was I who began the practice of embracing him,
Mm.
which I was grateful for. He hugged me back,
Mhm.
and it became something that I began to do there. And I'm not the world's biggest hugger, but I do enjoy doing that, and I
Mm.
appreciate doing that when people hug me. So and over the course of my clinical practice, I encountered a lot of men and women who said, my father has never, or my mother,
Mhm.
twice, has never said I love you to me. I
Mm.
Mhm.
don't know if they love me. And in the course of the conversation, I would ask them, well, um, have you thought about bringing it up?
Mhm.
And they were generally hesitant because they feared that that the possibility would become a reality, that they weren't loved.
Mm.
Yeah.
or they also said, well, we've got time. My father's in good health. My mother's in good health.
Mhm.
And I said, well, sometimes things change.
Right?
Yeah.
And I didn't push them beyond, but it would come up from time to time because it was a big issue if you doubted your parents' love.
Right, and it's so funny how we get entrenched in those practices, whether it's saying it or not saying it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then many of the cases, I would say more of the cases that didn't pursue it.
Mhm.
Sometimes people did. But when they didn't, and then a parent would die,
Mhm.
then the problem became bigger
Yeah.
because
Right?
no opportunity. The conversation could not happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the the fact of saying I love you to someone, if you are genuine, if you meant it, and I knew Ellen did, um, was an astonishing thing. And as I said in the blog post, a friendship like this means the world.
Mhm.
Certainly meant that to me and means that to me.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
so,
th-
let me just say one more thing.
mhm.
It's recognition of the passage of time,
Yeah.
both in my clinical practice and in this relationship that we're talking about,
Mhm.
because you never know. And both of you have lost parents,
Mhm.
and when in your case in a shocking way,
Mhm.
uh, an unpredictable way, and
Yeah.
but no one ever knows. So
Right.
it's an important issue for that reason too.
Yeah. It's interesting because I have this little sort of joke that it's become a joke in my family because I say to my kids all the time, "Guess what?" And then when they say what, I say, "I love you."
Mhm.
So now when I say to Mr. D, who's just turning 5, "Guess what?" He goes, "You love me?" But and
Yeah.
maybe it is to do with a little bit with my dad dying suddenly. It's we're not gonna go with that without that
Yeah.
unsaid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
repeat it regularly with my children too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Say goodbye. When
Mhm.
Absolutely. But I hear you about the trepidation,
Mhm.
when that hasn't been part of your childhood, or your lived experience where those words are said freely, carry that with you, into adulthood. And then when someone like your dear friend Alan, says that to you, it can be a little jarring. Um,
Mhm.
there's a vulnerability there, I think, for not having received, and then wondering about being the communicator of those words. It doesn't come as freely. Yeah.
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 Well, you described that there's 3 types of friendships. Can you, tell us those?
Well, this is according to Aristotle,
Mhm.
who I do not know personally, of course.
What?
So
Really?
We were just talking about the passage of time.
Yeah.
the 2,000-year-old man, or well, Aristotle. As a preface, I'll say this: Aristotle didn't think that if you wanted the highest form of friendship, the best kind of friendship, that there were going to be many such people available to you, because he didn't think
Mhm.
that there were that many people who were what he would call excellent or virtuous, and as completely as I think he hoped one could find in a friend. And so, with that in mind, he thought that there were 3 types, 3 categories. One was a friendship based on usefulness, a kind
Mm.
of instrumentality, where the person is almost, we didn't use this word, a tool,
Mhm.
almost a thing. If we think of it as a kind of, here's an example. You can, if you can get, according to a research study I saw a long time ago, you could get as fine an education in college at a good public university, let's say the University of Illinois
Mm.
or University of Iowa, something like that, and as you could get at Harvard or Yale or Princeton, the Ivy League. But what you couldn't get at those places that didn't have an Ivy League name attached to it, you couldn't make connection of the
Mm.
kind that you could
Mm. Mhm.
meet somebody who is the son of a senator, for example, or a man who will open a door for you in business. And then, of course, the children, that is your classmates, eventually take advantage of that. Many of them do, and will establish their own positions within whatever kind of business we're talking about or profession. And the consequence of that is that it is useful. So this is the kind. Now, if you take that away, if the connection back and forth, if you take somebody out to lunch to introduce them to the work you're doing in the hope of establishing them as a client, let's say, and you get to be friendly, that's the kind of friendship that Aristotle was talking about.
Mhm.
First level. It is a useful kind of relationship that lasts only as long as it is useful.
Mhm.
And there's not, it can be very pleasant, but it's not more than that.
Mhm.
So that's the first kind of friendship. And the second kind, which is a step up, is a friendship dependent on pleasure. Now, pleasure can go a lot of ways. It can be playing on a ball team together where you're pulling together as a team. It can be going to a ball game or going to a concert. And you haven't found anybody to accompany you, and so you find somebody who likes to go to concerts with you, and there's an exchange based on that. But you don't have too much contact outside of that. And there's sexual buddies. There's sexual relationships based exclusively on the sexual connection. And people can be kind to each other, but they're not looking, when they get together, you can be sure it's for sex. Maybe they have dinner, maybe they don't, but they're going to have sex. And so that's the kind of relationship that Aristotle was talking about with respect to pleasure. And then the third kind, and this he considered the highest estate of pleasure, was a relationship, a friendship based on virtue or excellence. Now there's a Greek word, it may be an ancient Greek word, it's arete, A-R-E, let's see, let me spell it, A-R-E-T-E, which refers to excellence.
Mm.
Now, it can be the kind of excellence of a virtuosity. A virtuosity, and I guess the Greek word probably, or the English word came from the same idea of virtue.
Mhm.
Virtuosity in the sense of you're a great pianist, or you're a great juggler, or you're a great singer. So there's excellence on that level, but there's also a second meaning, which has to do with the kind of thing that we usually think of when we think of the word virtue, of a moral estate, a
Mm.
kind of level of morality, consideration for other people, etc. And this was the kind of relationship he thought was the highest. And it is not to say that Aristotle thought that those other elements of friendship weren't present. They are, according to his definition. One still makes use in a friendly way of another friend who may know of a tip to get a job, and so you get the job, so you take them out to dinner. Okay, there's an exchange there.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, if it is a relationship of pleasure, if it is a relationship at the highest level, it also involves pleasure. I mean, you laugh with the person, you trade jokes, and you have good conversations.
Mhm.
But there is also uh, this level of excellence and virtue, and so as a consequence of that, if one friend, according to Aristotle, begins to fall away kind of at a moral level, at a level of living the kind of life that he had been living before, Aristotle thought it was the friend's responsibility to try to put him back on track.
Mhm.
And then, only then, if after repeated efforts to put him back on track, then you could end the relationship. But otherwise, you have an obligation. It's not a fair day kind of friendship,
Mhm.
just because it's
Mhm.
not days when the sun is out.
Mhm.
As we
Yeah.
know, the sun isn't always out. And if you're a friend of somebody, you want this other person to be there for you, and vice
Mhm.
Yeah.
versa. So that's what Aristotle had.
Yeah.
What I love about that is that it speaks to the investment, that the level of knowing in a friendship, that capacity to be brave and
Mhm.
confront, with love, with kindness, but take that step anyhow. Um, it's a quality I think that everyone seeks, in a deep friendship. But I think one question I have for you, Dr. Stein, I feel like there's so much confusion. Maybe it's, I don't know, when social media
Mhm.
exposure that people have different versions of themselves. The depth of friendship to me, it feels like it's on a sliding scale. And I think people use the word friend, friendship,
Mhm.
but I think in conveying that, often it's at an acquaintance level only, and people pick up on the nuances of the behavior of being friendly, which doesn't speak to friendship, in my mind at all. It's about being civil, cordial, but it's not friendship.
Right. I think that's very point very well made, Vicky. Thank you. It, it's I've noticed that too, and I guess Facebook got it started with you friend another person. Well,
Mhm.
okay, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Okay. Yeah.
um, it's it's hard because things move so quickly, and relationships. The conditions that make relationships as adults easier maybe don't exist as much as they used to. People are far more mobile.
Mhm.
I mean, I remember both the heartbreak of losing friends in grammar school
Mhm.
would move away,
Yeah.
but it was a rare event. Now it's
Mhm.
who's this week,
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
this week, uh,
Mhm.
and and it's much harder, even though we have Zoom, even
Mhm.
though we have telephones.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
There was an effort that was required to have a friend way back. You,
Mhm.
if the person didn't live really close, and I'm talking about before there was rapid kind of transportation,
Mhm.
just to make that clear. Uh, Back then, people would write letters, and they would write. First of all, they took the time because there was no way you couldn't type anything. You couldn't abbreviate words when you made a text message. You
Mhm.
had actually to take a pen and an ink,
Yeah. Yeah.
write the thing out, and think carefully because it was hard. You would scratch things out, but it was harder to do it, and then you'd have to wait for it a while. I mean,
Yeah.
some most I may have said this to you before, but I have the love letters from my
Mhm.
father to my mother in World War II,
Mhm.
and they wrote regularly. My mother didn't want me to see hers, but as she said about the letters my father wrote to her, I'm not going to show you the sexiest of them,
Mm.
but they were sexy anyway. You could see
Mhm.
they were just physically too. I mean,
Mhm.
care for each other, the physicality of it, and just
Mhm.
the want to be near the other.
Yeah.
And the upshot of it was that these things sustain the morale of people because
Mhm.
people cared. Well, if if you wrote those kinds of letters, which men and women tended to do, as I understand it, to people of the same gender, they tended not to do it to somebody of the opposite sex. It didn't, of course, it occurred, but it was relatively rare. And apparently some of the deepest relationships were between two men and two women, more than the arranged marriages that they were living with.
Hmm.
and the separateness of the lives that they lived, where a man was out in the field or the man was doing some sort of work outside the home, and the woman was taking care of the children and sewing the clothes. And I'm not in favor of those kinds of separations, but that's the way people lived for most
Yeah.
of.
Right.
So yeah, I think you're onto something very important about there was a casualness. There is a casual
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
ships today.
Because we're talking about sort of that investment of time that it takes to build a friendship. Can
Yeah.
you tell us how you've seen that investment pay off?
Yes, and I'm glad you used that phrase, Win. Um, it's a phrase I've used, and I'm sure Vicky's used it, and I'm sure everybody that listens to this will have used it multiple times.
Yeah.
It's a it is the way, unfortunately, I think, it's too easy to think of friendship in terms of, well, how much have I done for you and how much have you
Mhm,
done?
mhm,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't gotten the payoff that I deserve.
mm,
It's a kind of mercantile or business related
Mm.
question. And if a friendship does not have a friendship of the third type, especially that Aristotle's talking about, um, if a friendship does not have consideration not for the importance of not weighing things, not
Mm-hmm.
sort of taking an accountant, having an accountant saying, okay, am I getting what I deserve here
Yeah.
in the last week or in the last month or whatever?
mhm,
I have a friend, another friend, I haven't mentioned to you, John Kane, just the salt of the earth, a wonderful man. And John, I was in a cab with him, and he paid for the last cab ride or two, and I felt like I should pay for it. So John, I started to take out my wallet and say, "But John, you paid for the last couple of cab rides." He was starting to back me off, and he said, "Buddies don't count."
mm,
And that, I mean, of course there has to be some kind of equity. There has to
Yeah.
be some kind of balance. Um, but if it's mostly about balance, or if you're keeping track of it carefully, as I like to say to people, I didn't always say this in my life, you know, on my deathbed, I'm not going to say, "Where is that $5? I want that."
True enough, right?
mhm.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
There's another sort of area that you brought up in one of your recent posts, and it's about apologizing. Whether and it sort of flows right nicely from that idea
Yeah.
of counting. Um, when you feel like you're owed an apology or you need to apologize to somebody, that's a key part of friendship.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is absolutely a key part of friendship. The, it's something that I think one learns over time, and people easily get their back up. And I think there probably was a time in my life that I might have too. Uh, when and one of the dangers that people go into apology with the wrong kind of attitude because they think, okay, I need to apologize for this, but this other,
Mm. Mhm.
they'll go into it and they'll say, I want to apologize to you. I'm very sorry, but, and
Mhm.
launch into what you did to me.
Right.
Yeah.
And that'll kill it pretty effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the if you go into an apology with that sentiment of evening things out,
Mhm.
disappointed quite a lot.
Yeah.
My take on apology, which actually Aaron Lazar, who wrote a great book, a short book on, which is called On Apology. It's like an education in how to apologize, but it's very short. You have to go into an apology, the sense of, okay, I did wrong. That's all that matters.
Mhm.
And I need to put it right if I can. And if the other person balls me out, well, I get balled out. And if he says, "Oh, don't worry about it," that's fine too. If he says the relationship is going to end, okay, I did something that harmed him.
Mm-hmm.
Was important enough. And if I expect him to come back into a relationship because the relationship is strained and I reached out to him, then again, I think you just have to do it. And partly the reason that one does it is to put a put a bow on something. It's like, all right, this is what is my obligation. I have no control over your response.
Mm-hmm.
This is all I can do and all I should do. And so that is the kind of background to it. And I'll tell you a couple of examples, which one is a very old one. It involves a cousin of mine, Lynn, who is an attorney and was a social worker also, and was actually social worker after she changed careers. Lynn and I are about the same age, and so when families would get together, we would kind of just attach to each other, and our sensibilities were the same, and we seemed to connect pretty well. And so it happened that when Lynn and I were both maybe middle teenage years, something like that. Lynn's mother died after a brutal and 10-year battle with cancer. And so my dad took me to my Uncle Harry's house. And my aunt was, of course, was not my blood relative in this, and my Uncle Harry was. Anyway, not important. So we wound up going over there, and I said, you know, gave my condolences in probably some relatively inexperienced way, since I probably had not done that before.
Mm-hmm.
And Lynn was there, and we sat in the kitchen table, and we just started to talk. I expressed the same kind of feelings to Lynn, but the conversation quickly moved, as anybody who has been to visitations or shivas or anything like that comes to know. There's often a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of laughing, and there's food, and it's it tends not to be as grotesque. Not sometimes it is, but
Mm-hmm.
not to be in every instance.
Yeah.
So Lynn and I are talking, and we're having a pretty good time. And at a certain point, Lynn's telling something that had a story about something that happened to her. And it wasn't a fun thing. And I said, "Oh my God, that's a fate worse than death." And then in the split second after I said that, I
Yeah.
realized that was probably just about the worst thing. I could have spent 2 years working on what's the worst thing you can say to somebody after they've lost somebody that's dear to them. And I didn't know what to say, and I couldn't grab it back. I couldn't pull it out of the air and get it back down my throat. So I didn't say anything. Time passed, a lot of time. A few decades passed, several decades.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but this was always in the back of my mind. And it wasn't as if I hadn't had a number of other opportunities to say it. But about a period of 10 years went by, and not 10 years since the last time I had seen Lynn, maybe 30 years or 40 years after this event. And we were having lunch. And I said to her, "Listen, I want to talk to you about something." And so I reminded her of what happened, and I apologized. And she said, "You know what? I don't remember that happening." I carried this for decades, and for her,
Yeah.
it wasn't a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we hesitate, as I guess I must have been hesitating,
Mm-hmm.
express anything. And I had the opportunity, back to the fathers. Sometimes you don't get the chance.
Yeah.
But in any case, I took advantage of the chance I had finally, and it was perfectly fine. It was just one of I gather that probably how she felt was The tragedy wasn't in what I said. The tragedy was mother.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll tell you a different story, much more recent, and unfortunately it also has to do with death. A year ago, my friend Neil died after very long illness, and my friend Ron was Neil's best friend. Now, I came to know Ron. I knew Neil before this, but Ron and Neil and I got to know Ron at the same time when he transferred into Jameson Elementary School in Chicago.
Were Neil and Ron both zeolites?
Yes, you bet.
Okay.
We were, just for those who obviously the entire world does not know this, we were longtime friends who made a promise to reunite in 1963, reunite in the year 2000. 8 of the 10 of us who made the promise did. And when the Culligan Corporation got word of this, that we had asked the Culligan Corporation for T-shirts for our softball team, and Culligan refused. When this came out in Bob Green's column in the Chicago Tribune, Culligan got in touch with us. Culligan said, "We'll give you the T-shirts." 37 years late, they did, and this began, and they gave us $2,000 to do something good, and we started a scholarship at Mather High School, which we all attended, and we raised over the course of about 15 years $250,000 for scholarships in that really needy students. We weren't needy. We were working class students, most of us, but we weren't needy. Anyway, so Ron and Neil were dear friends, and I was a good friend of both. And we knew that Neil was sick, and Ron hadn't really, somehow Neil never communicated this to Ron. I don't know why. They had the conversations that they sometimes had, I guess, were fairly brief and sunnier than, and for some reason I found out about it before Ron did. But Ron was Neil's best friend and vice versa. What happens is we get word that Neil is dying. And Ron came into Chicago from Texas, and he saw Neil about 2 weeks before Neil died. And my friend Jeff, also a zeolite, Jeff and I and Ron met for lunch. And what happened was this, because Ron, the day before, he had seen Neil, and Neil was pretty much unable to speak at that. But clearly Neil was pleased to see Ron, and Neil's family was their closest relatives, Neil's son and so forth, and his daughter-in-law and Neil's wife, and I think Neil's sister Lynn was there too. So what happens is this: Ron comes in the day after this very sober event. He has seen his best friend for the last time. And he came into the pancake house that Jeff and I were already present at. And I'm a therapist or an ex-therapist. I tend to get to the heart of things, especially if I know people well. I know this is the thing we're going to talk about, so let's talk. And Ron came in and he sat down, and it wasn't long the seat was not warm before I said, "So how are you doing?"
Yeah.
And Ron's eyes welled up with tears. And Ron began to talk about Neil, of course, and that was the right thing to talk about. But before long, he started to talk about how he had an apology to make. And he said, when I've been in Chicago over the most recent years, we always saw him at the Zeolite scholarship events once a year.
Mhm.
But in fact, it turns out that he was also occasionally, at least, visiting his brother and sister who lived in Chicago.
Mhm.
And he said, I should have contacted you guys. And he was talking to Jeff and to me.
Mhm.
And so, he felt bad about that. It was evident in the way he said it. So I said to him, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm just glad you're my friend
Mm.
and you're allowed.
Mm. Mm.
So that's that was, I think, for a lot of reasons, as you can see, it's still a touching moment for me to think about and talk about. But
Mhm.
Yeah.
but this is what friendship is, and
Yeah.
Mhm.
have to. And Ron felt he had to apologize. That's wonderful, but there was no need. There was
Mhm.
no, because we loved him as
Mhm.
Alex.
Mhm.
What I love
Wow.
about that is that as you described, kind of getting to the heart of things because you knew that he had seen Neil the day before, and the first order of business in your head and heart was checking in, to ask how he was. But there's such a grace sometimes when you allow someone who needs to find their own way to say what's most important in the moment, and as you described, he talked around and then into what mattered most, and one of those what mattered most moments was him expressing, regret for not staying in touch. Even though you absolved him of that, it was something that he needed to say.
Exactly.
And it all began with your prompt, tell me how you're doing. And if we give them the time, and the grace to kind of get the words out according to the pace and the cadence that's right for them, it comes.
Yeah, and I think that's very well put, and it's consistent with what Simone Weil, the French philosopher who I'm
Yeah.
learning more and more about, said that you have to ask this question:
Yeah.
how are you suffering?
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing?
Mhm.
And just be present for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what an incredible podcast about friendship and all the different
Mm.
depth and breadth and um,
Yeah.
payoff of it.
Ah,
I'll use that term again, even though it's not. We know that as your friend says, buddies don't count.
That's right.
beautiful.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We love these podcasts with you and to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, and I love to be here with you. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.